It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Andrew today. I first met Andrew in 2010, and at the time I was frustrated by seeing lots of websites being produced that were to deliver online services that were kind of missing the mark, and they weren't really usable. And Andrew talked to me about his experiences with as head of design at gov.uk, and suddenly a light went on for me, and I had a framework, I guess, to make sure it never happens again. I got Andrew to do some training at DIA at the time, and I thought to myself, if I have my way, I'll get him to speak as many people in New Zealand government as possible. So as co-president of Govis, I get to have my way. So he's on today. So he also ran some workshops for us on Wednesday for practitioners on user-centered design. And today he'll be talking to us about how to build user-friendly digital services that people want to use. And something you may not know, well, you won't know about Andrew, is that he's a Kiwi. He's married to a Canadian. They have 4 kids, 4 born in the UK, 1 born here, and he's currently living in the US. So it's a truly global family. I look forward to hearing from Andrew about how not to launch dud websites. And Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Is this working? I wasn't with Gov UK, I was with the predecessor, DirectGov, and the role there was leading service design. It was interesting because it was more inheriting a whole lot of services that had been designed and then figuring out what to do with them. Hopefully we're working. Okay. Can I just have a show of hands? Who here is involved in designing services right now, whether it's fixing existing ones or building new ones? Can you raise high, just so I can get an idea of the ratio? Okay. Okay, cool. This is Steve Krug is an American guy who is quite famous for really pushing the idea of discount usability testing. The academics poo-poo him. I commissioned a study when I was at DirectGov using the University of York. They had a professor of human-computer interaction, an Aussie, I won't hold that against her, who ran the study for us. We ended up calling it the York test, and she conducted, as far as we know, the world's first review of every test methodology known to man and dogs to understand how, in a government or public sector context, you would quickly evaluate whether services are okay or not. The thing that was unique about that piece of work was we were not trying to say the service is good. We were trying to understand if a service was a dud. And so we didn't need to do a whole lot of testing, and we were looking for the minimum testing that we could do to understand whether there was a statistically significant probability that it was a dud. And Steve Krug was incredibly interesting to me because what we found when we did that review pretty much pointed to his methodology. I don't think he conducted that review, so good on him. I would recommend these 2 books. The first one, Don't Make Me Think, is what it says. It's all about learning how to stop forcing the user to have to think about things that they shouldn't have to think about. The second one is about how to do usability testing. And after the session, you may want to go and buy that. Okay, a little bit of background. I am a Kiwi, went over to England in end of '99, worked with the RAC, so a bit like the AA, ended up being head of business development there and basically putting services online. Was then poached and worked for Norwich Union Aviva and ended up running their online channels. So across all of the brands, we had a lot of traffic going through it. My accountability was the user experience, but also the operations of the digital services. Started a business 7 years ago called Digitalworks Europe. It started off as really a one-man consulting firm, and it's now growing. And our first contract was actually to DirectGov, who, at the time we left, had 28 million visits a month. And the role there was service design lead. I was hired by a Kiwi. There was only one person looking at all of services in DirectGov at the time. Her name was Charlotte Walsh, currently, I think, head of user experience for Barclays. And she hired me in and then promptly left. So I was left kind of holding it. And it was a hell of a lesson, and this is what I'm going to be unpacking for you today. I signed at the time a confidentiality clause, so I won't be sharing, I will be sharing facts and figures, but you won't be able to know who those facts and figures apply to. So if I drop anything, then whoops, that's a mistake. 3 years ago, we opened Digitalworks Pacific, which really is just a company. We're doing the work from overseas at the moment, and we're starting to work both in public and private sector here. So that's a little bit of who I am. I've got a lot of scars on my back, not literal, but from failing and screwing up in the digital space, and also have a number of successes. And so I speak to you from experience, and my hope for today is that I can share some of the experiences that we've learned in England, that I've seen clients experience in the States and here in New Zealand, and that in New Zealand you would be able to go and build some services on the shoulders of what's been learned elsewhere rather than having to learn the same lessons all over again. That would be my goal for this. So, the goal for building web services is not to build them. That's not the goal. The goal is to get to a point where people use them. It's really, really easy to completely lose sight of that. Very easy. To use them also isn't quite the point. They've got to use them successfully. In England, we use the phrase, I'm not sure if you use it here, avoidable contact. Avoidable contact is when somebody contacts an organisation, and from an organisational point of view, that was avoidable. I.e., had we handled them better beforehand, they wouldn't have contacted us. In the UK, as of about 4 years ago, one department alone receives 300,000 calls a day, which are avoidable. 300,000 phone calls a day, which are avoidable. So the objective in the UK was to build digital services that would reduce the avoidable contact by 50%. And that was the remit that I walked into service design at DirectGov with. The challenge was that very few people realized that the point of building a service is to make it so that people don't contact you afterwards. The point of building it is to be able to use it successfully and go, if I was doing it all over again, I would. That's the point. I don't yet think I've met an IT professional who has been briefed or told that by the person accountable for the project that they're delivering. Strong words. I don't think I've yet met somebody who's been told that that's the point. Just a very embarrassing incident for me. A number of years ago, I was walking down the road. I was walking from home to the railway station. Had my iPhone out. I think it was an iPhone 3 at that point, a fairly old one. And I was checking my emails as I walked. And walking along, absolutely fine. And then I suddenly grazed something with my left elbow, and I kind of just pulled my elbow in, and then realized that I was about to walk into an ambulance paramedic, and I had actually walked through an accident scene. A car had crashed. Somebody was blood all over them. The ambulance had arrived, and there was a scene of paramedics there dealing with it, and I physically walked through the entire thing because I was focused on sending an email. And in my experience, we focus on delivering a project, and we become completely oblivious to the point of the project. And it's not because we're evil or malicious or willfully rebellious. It's because we're just totally fixated on the thing we're doing, and we become unaware of the context around us. And that's the problem and the challenge. A reality check here, forgive me if I offend you, but you will learn that this is the case. Whether you learn it from me or not doesn't really matter. Well, it sort of does matter from a taxpayer perspective. But you will learn that this is the case if you haven't already. And you'll either learn it by learning yourself through screwing up, or you'll learn it by learning from somebody who has screwed up and has learned the lesson for you. The choice is how you want to learn it. My understanding is that you've been set a goal of 70% of transactions being online by 2017. Is that right? Okay. Forgive me if this next slide seems a little noddyish. But it took me a couple of years of being in service design before I realized it. If the point is to have 70% of people is to have 70% of transactions online, is the idea that you have 70% of people starting the transaction or completing the transaction? How many of you have a business case that actually says the objective of this product or this project is to have 70% successful completions? Does anyone have a business case that says that? Does anyone have a business case that doesn't even refer to 70%? Oh, this is real. I love it. I was told by both Matt and John that Govis was enjoyed by those that came because you told the truth. There's an English word I absolutely adore. My father doesn't particularly like it, but it's bollocks. It just kind of rolls around in the mouth. Oh, actually, that's a terrible picture, isn't it? But the word comes out so nicely. Oh, terrible. But the point is to have 70% of people completing, finishing. How many people have to start, and how many have to be able to get through to end up with 70%? This is a really, really sobering question. It's seriously sobering. If the idea is to have 70% of people complete, and if 80% of all those who start completed successfully, just as a point of reference, Amazon's target is 80%. They have a couple of people working on user experience, and they've got a few years of practice. Their target is 80%. If 80% can complete, you'd need 88% of the population for whom the service is intended to start using it online. Think about that for a minute. Think about your business case, if you've got one. Think about the total number of people for whom the service is being built, and think about that population in New Zealand. What proportion of them really, is it 2 of you have that? Yeah, right. How many of them, yeah, right, are actually going to go online and actually start to use the service? That's got to be 88% if you can deliver a completion rate of 80% to get to 70% are done online. It'd be a lot easier just to have a perfect completion rate, and then you only need 70% of the population to get 70% of people using it. So maybe we should aim for that. The point of this is that you've got a start number, you've got a complete number, and those multiplied equal your take-up number. Really simple math. Forgive me for being patronising. I'm not trying to be patronising. It took me years to twig to the fact that this was the commercial reality that the chief financial officer of whether it's a public sector or private sector, this is the reality that they are assuming in their head but have never said out loud, and the project team has not cottoned on to, and so we're set up to fail. So on that cheery note, how do we get to 70%? What I'm going to share with you now, and I've ummed and ahed about this is our IP. So we have spent some hundreds of thousands of dollars getting to this. It has taken a number of years. It has taken a lot of fails and, just blood, sweat and tears. And the conclusion I've come to is I'm a Kiwi, so I really want New Zealand to succeed in doing this. I don't want you to go through the same pain we've been through in England, same pain that Obama's been through. So giving this to you, if you're going to copy it right. Don't change it, amend it, don't take pieces out of it or play with it. If you think there's a better way of doing it, please get in contact with me and we'll update it and send you a new version. But please don't mess with it because it works. There's 3 slides I'm going to show you, and they just go into 3 layers. Building an online service is all about the people. This is really difficult. I don't know about you, but I'm not that people-orientated. I'm much more technology-orientated and process and getting all the stuff done. I'm not that good with the people side. So this is really difficult, having to kind of go and take the technology part, which is all very logical and sequential and safe, and suddenly we've got to deal with people who are messy and chaotic and all over the place. But actually, if we're going to succeed, we've got to deal with the people, and that's really hard. So this is almost a slightly depressing slide from an IT perspective because one has to focus on the fact that it's all about the people. The good news is there's some process stuff following. This is the anatomy of a digital service. The 7 parts. The 7 parts are in capitals. The grey bar that goes along the top is the part that the user experiences. We define a user as somebody who comes to use something, and a customer as somebody who's used it and would do so again. Now, they may be paying you money. They may simply be using something and it's free. A customer is defined as somebody who's partaking of what it is that you offer. Okay? So the point is for a user to become a customer. The objective, if you are building a service, is to convert, it's almost religious language, to convert a user into a customer, assuming they want to become one. You know, you've heard the story about the Boy Scout who helped the old lady across the road and they discovered she didn't want to cross the road. We're not trying to turn a user into a customer who doesn't want to be a customer, because actually what we have isn't what they're after. But those who are, our job is to convert them. It is to get them through, and we have failed if we don't. So the journey that they go through comprises a trigger. The trigger is the last thing that occurred before they began to engage with whatever your service is. Okay? The reason the trigger is important is it tells you how motivated they are. A little bit cliche, but if your trigger is a letter from the tax department saying that we're going to fine you $200 if you don't submit this return, then you're highly motivated. You can have a really crappy experience, and you're going to work very hard to get through that experience so you don't get fined. If, on the other hand, you've been out for Sunday lunch with your nana, and she said, come on, you keep complaining about your job, go get a new one, then you're not very highly motivated, but you kind of have a sense of obligation because she's told you to, so maybe you go into a job site and you spend 1 minute looking at it, and then you get confused, so you give up. But in your mind, you can justify, well, at least I had a go. But you're not, no high motivation, therefore you're not going to persevere. So the trigger is important because it tells you how, or it tells you as a service designer how motivated the people are coming through it. So one's got to go and talk to whoever's accountable for communicating this thing to find out what the triggers are going to be. Are they going to pay for any triggers? Or is it going to be purely organic because there's no budget? And therefore, unless it's amazing, no one's ever going to know about it or find it or use it. So you need to understand what the triggers are. Search is how they find it. Typically, it's a search engine, whether it's Google, Yahoo, Bing, whatever. Sometimes it could be the classifieds. It could be an ad in a magazine. It's however the person locates where this thing is, whether that's in the digital world or in the physical world. Content, this is the fun part. If you take an online service, you've got content and transactions. Again, I'm being slightly trite here. The content is something where you aren't able to talk to it. Well, you can, but it isn't going to say anything back. You can't communicate anything to it. So it's words, pictures, media, it could be audio, video, whatever. But it's something that you consume. iPads used to be known as content consumption devices. That's changing. You can now start to do stuff on them, and you can do amazing creative things on them. But they were thought of as kind of content-rich, not that hot in transactions, but it was a fallacy. Anyway, so content is about what you receive or digest. The business knowledge, this yellow bit underneath it, is what the organization knows. And what typically happens, the organization will vomit everything it knows onto a bunch of web pages. And so the business knowledge and the content are the same. Have you ever found a site or an experience that's like that? Okay. There are some organizations who are incredibly protective and jealous over what they know, and they almost play a game which ticks off the user of, we're not going to tell you anything that you want to know, good luck finding it. Doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. They're two extremes. The common one is to just vomit. The trick is to go and discover who your user is, and there's 3 things. What do they want to know? What do they need to know that they probably don't want to know? And what misconceptions are they laboring under that you need to pop? Classic one is student loans. Sometimes 18-year-olds think it's a grant, i.e. they don't have to pay it back. It's a good one to pop. Sometimes the political masters don't want to pop that one because they want more people going to university, but that's a whole other thing. So the content needs to be written in the context of knowing who the user is, so that when they come to it, they find what they need, they find what they want, and they learn, or their minds are changed about the stuff that they've got the wrong end of the stick about. That's the content part. The transaction is when they can now do something. So at a very simple level, they might type in a postcode, or they might type in everything to do with their tax, and they submit a tax return. Okay, so a huge range of things in there. These are fun because there's 3 dimensions to it. The business process is kind of like the town planning. It's the person in the organization or the function in the organization who designs how the organization handles a transaction. So it might be you need to give us this bit of information, this bit of information. We're going to go double check that bit of information, come back and validate with you. Then we're going to check that your identity is who you say it is before we let you do anything further. Once we know that you are who you say you are, then you can go and use it. That's a complicated one. But there's a business process, and in theory it's been designed. I'm sure you've never come across a situation where the systems have defined the business process. Does anyone? Where here's the business process, maybe someone's been able to afford having a couple of business analysts, and it's all beautifully laid out. And then, anybody from procurement here? And then procurement go off and say, well, Oracle has this package that's out of the box, and it's cheaper than the customizable version. But now they've got an out-of-the-box customizable version as well, but it's not as customizable as the non-out-of-the-box customizable version. So we can save money if we buy that. Why don't we do it? Okay, we now have that. Does it work? No. What's our alternative? Egg on face, admit, fess up, sort it out? Or we'll make it work. Anybody been in those kinds of projects? And so you end up with a business process that was designed by Oracle. Not knocking Oracle, but they don't know your business. I'm sure that the Oracle service that would be appropriate for your business would be great for it, but the one out of the box probably isn't. Anyone remember that the point of this was the user becoming the customer? So we've currently talked about the business process and the systems. Guess what? If your biggest problem is getting 80, how many, I forget the percentage we had now before, of users becoming customers to get 70% at the far end, then do you think we want to let the system define the transactional experience? There's a few shaking of the heads. Do you think we want to let the business process define the customer's experience? In an ideal world, how would you want to define the customer experience? What the customer wants. It's heresy, isn't it? It's ridiculous. It's like putting the artists in charge. Anyone ever been in a project where the transactional experience was designed for the customer, and then the business process was amended, and then the back end was replaced, or updated, or changed? Has anyone been in a project like that? No one. I thought there wouldn't be many, but I didn't think it would be no one. Okay, so we're all understanding the challenges. If you're going to have take-up, that magic percentage at the very end, then users need 7 things. Who's heard of business requirements? Everybody. Who's heard of user requirements? Who's ever actually gone out to users to actually gather their requirements as opposed to being the business person, written a bunch of requirements you think the user wants, written user requirements above it and gone, there we have the user requirements. There's a hand up. These are 7, it's taken a long time to learn these. These are 7 generic user requirements which are, I've not yet found a time where they have not been true. But I have found hundreds of services that have never been built with any of them in mind, other than safety, which is the user's word for security. If you could do nothing else other than this, but spend the next 3 years building services in New Zealand that satisfy those 7 criteria, your chances of lifting the percentage of completion rate would climb dramatically. We normally charge tens of thousands of pounds to show people this. So, as I say, copy it right. Useful is probably the most difficult one. And in this context, I don't know how many of you actually ever get a chance to play in that space. But useful, basically, water flows down, yeah? From a user's perspective, they will find the easiest way of doing whatever the task is that they need to do. And if the online experience is not very helpful, then guess what? They won't use it. It's not rocket science, but it is a truth. It's a bit like gravity. You can fight it all you want, but it will win. If it is not useful, people won't use it. It doesn't matter if somebody's mandated it. It doesn't matter if the CIO has said you have to do it. It doesn't matter if 100 million gets put behind it. It's a complete waste of time. If it isn't useful to the user, they won't use it. End of story. If you work in the financial services industry, what people will do is go and build a transaction, put it online, and then turn off every other channel and say, now they'll use it. Guess what happens? They lose business because they go to the competitor who hasn't been such a wally. They won't do the thing that isn't useful. It sounds so simple, but it has a profound, profound implication. Findable, it's kind of obvious. It's got to be findable. It needs to be easy to use. Again, this is kind of obvious. But how many of you prioritize building something that's easy to use? It's got to perform, and the performance here from a customer's perspective doesn't mean that the email gets sent. It means it gets sent at a time that is helpful. The example that I continually trot out is if you've ever bought travel insurance and then you've made a claim and you found that you were rejected in your claim because you bought it after you left the country, then you'd understand the pain of this. An awful lot of travel insurance, and I can't remember the numbers now, is bought at the last minute. I'm sure that all people who are not like you, I confess I have bought it regularly at the last minute. And when you buy it at the last minute, you're in the departure lounge, and an iPhone's wonderful, and an iPad with a 3G connection is also wonderful, because you can now order it, buy it, but guess what? You need the email within the 12 minutes that you have before you have to go through the gate. And if you don't have the email within 12 minutes, then you don't have an insurance policy, and you can't get it refunded. So the performance requirement from the user is less than 12 minutes. But I was well organized because I gave myself 12 minutes to buy it. What about the person who has less time than that? You get the point. 4 hours, 2 days, 1 week, doesn't cut it. One's got to go and understand the context of the user. It always comes back to the people. What's their context? What do they need? When do they need it? Build that into your spec, the user requirements. It's got to be understandable. This is absolutely critical. They've got to understand what on earth it is that you're saying. Financial services is plagued by this. The government, I'm guessing, is plagued by this, but the stories don't usually come out in the press. Where when somebody has the wrong end of the stick and don't understand it, then there's an implication and a ramification. It's very important. Lloyds have just discovered that in all of the payments for PPI. Barclays are finding it. You know, insurance that's been missold. It has to be satisfying. And this, again, is not kind of noddy. This is not lava lamp and all sorts of nice, fluffy stuff. It has to be satisfying at a functional level, which means that if I was doing it again, I would do it again. If it is not satisfying, then I will broadcast to other people. I don't mean me. Each of us will tell people who we know about how such and such let us down. The sting is if it isn't satisfying. If only when it is satisfying, they'd tell everybody how wonderful it is. The dynamics of that are actually that if it is significantly above their expectation, then they will boast about it. But there's a whole delta which has to be significant, that it's got to be, if their expectation is here, it's got to be here before they bother telling people about it. But if their expectation is here and you deliver to here, they'll tell people about it. So you don't get away with this, but you've got to be way above here before they start to tell people. Performance I've gone into, and then the safety, that question simply boils down to, and this is a bit of a sting to the tail, are they more or less vulnerable as a result of having dealt with you? Ouch. Not just at the time of the transaction, but subsequently. How do you look after their data? Where's the data stored? When an agency gets given some data, how do you send it? How do you make sure that people know? I don't know if you've sort of heard about it in England, but we've had a number of mistakes where people have sent not classified, but certainly protected information via courier. There's been a human error, and it's gone in a bag that's not been marked. I think there were 10,000 names of vulnerable children that were disclosed, when was it, maybe 18 months ago. A department lost 2 DVDs a number of years ago with hundreds of thousands of people's data on it. Now, whether it was actually compromised, as in somebody used it, I don't know, but it was compromised in terms of it was out there. So, Why? Because it's the taxpayers' money. This is a continuum that we ended up putting together for DirectGov. And I had always imagined this as being like a seesaw. You'd have one point in the middle. And it would either be a good service, in which case the good part would go down, or it would be a rubbish service, in which case the rubbish part would go down. But we discovered that there are two tipping points. I don't know if it's physically possible to have two tipping points, but there are effectively two tipping points. The lower one is the minimum acceptable standard. And the higher one is the one where it actually does what it was supposed to do. Now, perhaps in real life this shouldn't exist, but it does. To the left of the minimum acceptable is stuff which, frankly, isn't fit for human consumption. So what we mean by that is it's a service that should never have been put live, or something's happened to it and it shouldn't be live now. I don't know if you can think of any services like that in the Kiwi context. I'm trying to think of some I can tell you about. There's one, I'm going to have to be very oblique about this. There's one that I remember testing, and let's just put it this way. The people that it was for hadn't been designed for them, but the people that were supposed to be able to use it were the very people who couldn't use it. If I tell you why, then I've just blown their cover. I can't. But if you use your imagination, you can probably figure out slightly laterally who that group might be. And when they realized this, they chose to keep it on because it saved money, because people couldn't use it. I hope I've kept that quiet enough. The middle category means that the thing works, but it doesn't realize any benefits. And most services are in this category. On the right is where it works and it does what it was supposed to do. It's actually useful. People can find it. They use it and go, hey, cool, it actually does what I need it to do. And I'm slightly shocked. I'm going to tell people because the expectation was maybe here and it's up here. And from a chief financial officer perspective, actually we get the money that we hope to get because it did what it was supposed to do. We've reduced avoidable contact. People aren't phoning us afterwards and, hey, everyone throws a party. This is where we ought to be living. But we're not. So the question that I would ask you is, where is the service that you're designing, or where is the service that you're responsible for, or where are the services that are in the domain that you have some influence over? With the framework, you've now got a way of measuring, or beginning at least to assess, how it does on this continuum. What we need is a method where what the organization or the business needs, and what the user needs, and what we can physically deliver all get put in the blender and commonly satisfied. That's what we need. And then we also need to know that they all will be satisfied before we commit to the point of no return. Ideally, before we commit to the full expenditure of building this thing. That's what we need. Has anybody ever heard of anything like that? Well, the good news is the military have been doing it for dozens of years, and civil engineers have been doing it for dozens of years. Imagine what would happen if you had a bridge that had never been stress tested before people started driving on it. It does very rarely happen. I was seeing a car park once in Christchurch that was being built, and I think it was the second level had physically collapsed. I'm guessing that civil engineer was perhaps a student. But in civil engineering and in the military, this is common practice. It absolutely isn't common practice in digital. But in the public sector particularly, and for any organisation who are doing transformational work where there's a large expenditure, we can't afford not to adopt this method. Okay. We have somebody from Capity calling. And how do I pull this away? Jason and Angela have been really brave. They're doing what I hope we'll all do. And that is they've taken a look at some services that are in their domain, and they've said, I wonder how they're doing against what a user needs. I wonder. There's a bit of context here. I really take my hat off to them because they've come straight out and they've said, we've got 4 tools that all do the same thing. Wish they were different instances of the same tool, but no, they're not. There's 4 tools that have been built. I mean, there's slight subtle differences, but they all do the same thing. They all find schools. Wouldn't be enough to build 1 tool to find schools, so let's build 4. And then we've also got 2 apps. We've got an Android app and we've got an iOS and Apple app. So actually we've got 6 tools. Do users get from the tools what they need? No one's asked the question. So, talk to you a second about we need a process that looks like this. There is a process that